Hello and welcome to our first poem of this unit. The first one that we're going to start off with here is Robert Frost's Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood, also known as The Road Not Taken. This poem was written in the early part of the 20th century, somewhere around the either before or right at the beginning of the First World War. So, bear that context in mind and our possible interpretation of what the poem might mean. So, let's start off first by reading the poem, and then we'll do a couple of different things. First, we will analyze the poem itself. Since we actually have an image with this poem, we will then analyze the image and its interpretation of what the poem means. Alright, let's get started. So, the poem starts off, Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really 'bout the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I ever should come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So let's start first with an analysis of what the poem itself means. We're going to start with that just by making sure that we understand all of the words. Diverge means to split away from. First, you notice that it looks very close to the word merge, which means to come together. Die is a prefix that means to, and it's verging away, it's moving away from one another. The next one that we want to make sure that we understand is undergrowth. Undergrowth is a word that we don't use too often anymore, but we still have a little bit of it from time to time, especially if you like to travel out in the countryside, you like to go hiking, or you go down into the gorge. Undergrowth is all those small plants that grow under trees. It's as simple as it looks. The next one that we want to make sure that we understand is, it's here somewhere, trodden. To tread means to step on. Trodden is just the past tense form of that. Now, in U.S. history, Benjamin Franklin has a really famous snake that says, "Don't tread on me." This, if you can make the connection here, that's all that word is. Don't step on it. It doesn't mean don't step on me here, but that's what the word itself means, to step on. And that should be it. So in this poem, our speaker is traveling, and they're wondering to themselves, where do I go? I notice that in my life I have these two possibilities. I could take the path on the right, or I could take the path on the left. And the speaker stops for a moment to consider, what would life be like if they follow these different paths? The path on the right or the path on the left? And we look, and in the second stanza, we see, or actually at the end of the first stanza and into the second stanza, our speaker he looks down one, and then he looks down the other. And he's talking about how one of these paths has been frequented. People have taken it more often than the other. We see that in, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. But if he goes down that path, right, the one that has not been tread on as often, though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. So if this speaker goes down the less traveled path, then the paths will be pretty much even in nature of how often people have gone down them. So it's not necessarily one is always taken and the other one not nearly so. They're pretty even, but one is definitely traveled a little more often than the other. And when we get into the third stanza, we see the speaker starting to get a little almost whimsical and nostalgic, meaning the speaker spends a long time thinking about these different paths, and he finally makes his decision. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I ever should come back. And yes, I know that I'm inverting the word order here, but I'm trying to make it make more sense for you. The speaker, by this point, has already made his decision. He knows which way he's going to take. But he's not going to take the first one. He's going to take the second. And this leads us to our final stanza. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, when we get to this final stanza, we're analyzing, what we'll be analyzing here is one interpretation of what the poem means. And what I will be highlighting for you are individual lines. Now, one of the themes of this poem is sort of contemplative, it's introspective, it's hopeful in a way, but it's a little bittersweet in that hopefulness, right? It's contemplative, meaning it's thinking, it's about thinking, especially because it's about thinking about the future, and it's introspective. Intro means inward, spective, glasses used to be called spectacles. It's inward looking. And it's also hopeful somewhat. It's a little bittersweet and it's hopeful. And the way that Mr. Mayo is going to back up that claim is we start off earlier where we talk about, the speaker talks about how one of the paths is a little less traveled by, they might be somewhat equal in nature, but by the time we get to this final stanza, I shall be telling this with a sigh. A sigh of what? A sigh of happiness? A sigh of contentment? A sigh of disappointment? I shall be telling this with a sigh. That sigh means a lot, because is that sigh, is it a good sigh or is it a bad sigh? And Mr. Mayo is going to say that it's a bit of a regretful sigh. Not regretful in the, oh man, I really shouldn't have eaten all of that cake. More of a, I really wish that I had the lifespan or the means of living both of these lives, because I'd really like both of them. But I've got to make a choice. I have to live just one of them. And if I have to make a choice, I'm going to take the one less traveled by, the one that's not taken as often, because it makes all the difference out of what I want in life. Now, that's just one interpretation of what the poem means. And you'll notice that with this image, you might have already been cluing in on this, there's not necessarily this interpretation as according to this image, whoever created this picture, as that sigh or the tone of the poem being as regretful in a sense. Because if we follow the images used, we notice that there's this parallelism going on, right? There's A, He's smiling, he's smiling. He's going off to explore the world, or he's going into college. Exploring the world, doing his thing, studying, falling in love, getting a job, finding new love, right? Maybe this was just young passion. Still, same woman over here. Maybe this is the same woman, finally settled down. Now, in this one, his family has grown, so his son has had his own child, and by the end, we see the same old balding man. He sits in a different chair, he has different pictures highlighting the different focuses in his life. In the college version, there's a picture of his probably him and his wife when they were younger, and his son, or maybe his grandson. And over here, where he was a traveler, we see a picture of his dog, maybe some friends, some outlines, some backgrounds, maybe one of those women that he was with, and it converges, right? Converge, meaning coming together. It means a similar thing to merging, but converge means that those two paths have come back together because he's the same old man. He's lived a good life, no matter which path he took. And that leads me to suspect, right? Because we had this one path, we had this one guy starting off, the roads that he could have taken diverged between column A, column B, the right path, the left path, and then they converge back together to the same old man, made better by his experiences in life. He's older, he's wiser, he knows more, he's happy, right? He's smiling the same smile. He's got the same balding head. He's got the same, it's not the exact same, but there's still parallelism going on here. He's lived this long, fruitful life, and he comes back together from once having been a young man to now being this old man, wizened, old, but happy all the same. Now this image takes a completely different interpretation of what Mr. Mayo just had as his interpretation, and you know what? That's great. That's great, because both interpretations are just as valid. And if you have a different interpretation, that's also just as valid, right? And now I am going to modify that, right? Just as valid, so long as you can pull out evidence. Remember when Mr. Mayo was just a moment ago pulling out these individual verses. I shall be telling this with a sigh and exploring, what is that sigh? Is that sigh happy? Is it sad? Is it regretful? Is it content? What sort of sigh is that? Is that a sigh of almost a yawn? Oh man, I've had a long and fruitful life. And that has made all the difference, right? Mr. Mayo had his own interpretation, and he pulled out individual verses and he focused in on specific words to try and explain the understanding that he had for this poem. Now, what I want you to do, and I'm fairly certain that I'm going to have you do this at some point, make your own analysis. What words do really pop out in your head when you read this poem? Or what words really stuck out for you? What words were the most evocative, right? What words spoke to you? Because our focus in poetry needs to be more about, well, we definitely need to understand that we need to do some critical reading. We need to be able to read closely, analyze not just words, but the images. But also now, what is your interpretation? How did this poem speak to you? What meaning, what imagery did you take away from this poem? That matters. That matters just as much as being able to understand Mr. Mayo's analysis, being able to understand the author, the creator of this images analysis, and it's just as important, if not more important, for you to be able to understand, gee, you know, I was listening to Mr. Mayo read this, and I had to come back to it maybe later on, and it painted A, B, C for me. It painted this picture for me, and I can show you. Look at this verse right here. This is why. I want you to be able to do that. So, take a moment and read through the poem again and ask yourself, what meaning did I take away from this poem? And that shall make all of the difference for you. Bye-bye.